Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and we're talking about the Manuscripts Club, The People Behind 1,000 Years of Medieval Manuscripts by Christopher de Hamel, which is a book I just barely squeaked in and finished because I was enjoying it, so I did it for the channel. Anyways, so this is a guy talking about manuscripts. I have a lot of pictures to get through, so we're going to have to be doing literally basically more than a picture a minute. So what we have is Christopher de Hamel, who worked at Sotheby's auction house, specializing in manuscripts, among other things, wrote this book basically as a kind of, it's partly biography, and it's partly just a discussion about people, discussions about people who were associated with manuscripts. But bits of this are, very interestingly, what those of us on the internets might call a self-insert real person fan fiction. Because his initial impulse for this book, let's move forward to a picture from the interior of a manuscript, because manuscripts, these medieval manuscripts, are frequently gorgeous. I could not put all the pictures in here. If you want to see all the pictures, you could read the book, or possibly, oh look, I had a leftover zoom image thing left. Well, let's just pretend that that zoom image in the middle of the picture isn't there. Basically, his initial impetus for this book was meeting at a manuscripts club, which is, like any other club, a collection of people who are interested in the same thing. A manuscripts club is the same thing as a sci-fi con, that you have a whole bunch of people who like the same stuff, and they get together in the room, and they talk about their interests, and they may be from all walks of life, all political stripes, all sorts of backgrounds, histories, cultural who's-its, whatever, but they share that common interest. And he got this idea of tracing manuscripts and these people who were inextricably bound up with historically with manuscripts. And among other things, you can trace how this history goes by the pictures of these people. I don't have pictures of all of them, and how those pictures appear. This is an image of Saint Anselm, who is the first person in his book. These are roughly moving forward in time, taken from a manuscript, and this is basically your bog standard medieval picture of a person. Taken, like I said, from a manuscript. You can see down at the right there's like writing and stuff. So then the next one that we see is the Duc de Berry, who is, well, French, but was a avid manuscript collector, but more than that, an avid patron of manuscripts. He kept ordering more and more books of hours because he just loved manuscripts. He loved having beautiful, illuminated, illustrated things filled with these pictures and pages upon pages of beautiful paintings. This is taken from a manuscript, and it's a picture of that Duke in the middle there. This is a page from an illuminated manuscript, and as you can see, if you look at this is one of the beauties of manuscripts, is these pages where you have this dense handwritten text, because manuscriptum, that's written by hand, hand, scriptum, writing, that you have these beautiful pages filled with beautiful illustrations and designs and all kinds of things. And so manuscripts are just fantastic to look at, just strictly from a purely visual artistic perspective, never mind the historical value of period writings about whatever. Then you have Simon Benning, and you hear here Simo Bennick, Alexandrum Sepsu. My Latin isn't that good, and I've never been that good at looking at these. This is, you can see how this particular portrait is getting smidgens closer to a more modern portrait of a person, sort of in a closer to the idiom of what we would think of as standard portraiture in this modern age. Benning was an illuminator of manuscripts. That is, what he did for a living was do all of those paintings like this. Now, if you look at this, This is fantastic. Simon Benning is actually 16th century by this point, 1500s into the 1600s perhaps. That it's at the tail end of when manuscripts were a thing, because once the printed book had been invented, you stop needing to have somebody sit down and write all this stuff out by hand. And so printed books, because they could be punched out so much faster, because you could guarantee that every single time you got it right, because it's easier to avoid errors in spelling and recopying when you're basically putting all of this text down in advance, checking it against the text, and then printing it so that it makes things easier to transmit accurately. Had a lot of advantages from a strictly knowledge perspective, but you had this loss. So Simon Benning is starting to, he's appearing starting towards the end of that period, but you can see this. This is a beautiful piece of work, and this is like on a page in a book. So it was really, really small, really, really delicate work. We have Sir Robert Cotton, who was a collector. That he was somebody who worked in collecting manuscripts for others, and we have now a much more modern portrait. This is, 17th, 16th century portraiture as sort of we think of it now. But you can also see this much more realistic drawing. I am racing through these because I'm hoping to finish all of my pictures and have something else to say at the end, because the self-insert fanfic part of this is super interesting. This is, again, another page from an illuminated manuscript. These are these illuminated letter pages that are just so fantastic. You see a lot of this sort of thing in the Book of Kells, and it's all worth looking at, really. This is a section out of David Oppenheim, who was a Jewish manuscript collector, who he was setting out to try to preserve Jewish writings and traditions, and not fiction, but religious writing. Because if it were fiction, then it would have been done in Yiddish. You didn't use Hebrew at that time as sort of a vernacular. Nobody used Hebrew as a vernacular. You couldn't use Hebrew as a vernacular. Your vernacular as a Jew was the lingua franca of Jews, and that is Yiddish. Or whatever. There were a few historical things that were like Yiddish. But anyways, you would have spoken regional things, and that's what you would have put in, that's what you would have, written your fiction in and stuff. But you look at this, and because Jews are enjoined, as several other religious sects are, from putting imagery into their religious texts, they do other things, like this incredibly weird paragraphing here. Is these strange diamonds to sort of decorate the text without violating the prescriptions. So this just always sticks out to me. We follow that by Jean-Joseph Rive, who is another collector, effectively another librarian, somebody who collected books on behalf of an employer. He was also known as loud and difficult to get along with. And finally, we start to hit the 19th century. We hit the invention of the photograph. You can see as we're moving forward in time. This is Constantine Simonides, whose name we don't actually know for sure. That's just what he told everybody his name was, who was a Greek forger. He made fraudulent things to sell to people, and he had a moment in history. Anyways, but you can see the age of the photograph because, among other things, of how carefully staged it is, because this was this was at the time when you still had to have an exposure where the person being photographed had to just sit still for like 20 minutes until the exposure took. It's one of the reasons why they took photographs of dead children, because dead children would sit still. Well, that's not the only reason, but yeah. Following this, we have here Sir Sidney Cockerell, who died in 1967, and he was, as a couple of people were in this, he worked for museums. He worked for official governmental institutions to try to build out their manuscript collections. And the author actually, this is an author who was working in Sotheby's in 1975. And so he actually personally met people who had met Sir Sidney Cockerell. This is a 1960 portrait of Cockerell, who had been bedridden for years and was bedridden up until his death after that point. And you can see this is an entirely modern sketch. This is a portrait that is a 20th century modern portrait, just completely in that idiom. And finally, this is an impressionist portrait of the only woman who was a focus of a chapter. She's not the only woman in this book. There are other women, indeed other women who are experts in fields, noted in this book. But Belle de Costa Green is a woman who managed to manage Piers Morgan, like the original Millionaire's fortune and his manuscript collection, that she worked herself up into that position, eventually creating a public trust and a sort of a public archive that she managed for, years and years and years. This woman is triply incredible because she is not only a woman who managed this and was managing this in the 1920s and in through the 30s and into the 40s. This is a woman who was born, she's black. Now, she was pale enough to pass, and the de Costa in her name was at least partly an effort on her part to explain away the fact that she is slightly darker skinned than most white people by saying that she was actually Portuguese, because Portuguese people have a tendency to be darker skinned than people from more northern Europe. And so she would tell people that she was from a combined Dutch and Portuguese background, allowing her to effectively pass. And, yes, slavery had been over for a decently long time, but it's still a very, very difficult, it was still a very, very difficult thing, and a dangerous thing if she had been caught out, if somebody had realized that her father was an African-American civil rights person, if anybody had actually realized that's what he was. Apparently he ran off with somebody and vanished into Europe, so her mother basically dropped his surname, which was Greener, changed their name to Green, and, said, well, we're just not having anything to deal with him. But anyway, so she became a powerful, wealthy woman who handled expensive manuscripts with great expertise and extreme determination. So, we have this cast of characters whom I have skipped over some because I was zipping through things in here very, very quickly. But let's back up to a pretty manuscript picture. So, our author, the part of this that's self-insert is the fascinating part in each chapter when our author decides that he's going to describe what it might be like to talk to one of these people, to meet these people. That in this very first chapter with St. Anselm, one of the things that he does is he doesn't merely say, and that he imagines, meeting St. Anselm and talking about manuscripts with him, talking about things that they would share interests about, and what it's like to visit the monastery where St. Anselm had lived. But he actually takes literal quotes from other people's meetings with St. Anselm and works them into his mental image. And he does this in nearly every single chapter, and closes out the book with a lovely, if strange, idea of imagining everybody in this book meeting all at once together to discuss manuscripts, to hang out around a table. And he has these images of each person and what they would talk about to each other person and how the conversation would go. It's a fascinating book and very interesting, and I recommend it. So that's everything, and I will see you all next week.